So we're going to talk about complex numbers or complex solutions for a quadratic equation. So complex solutions. Recall that we talked about a quadratic function or quadratic equation. A quadratic function is denoted by f of x equals to a x squared plus bx plus c. Well, we talked about the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient is this guy here. A is called the leading coefficient. Very well. If A is positive, then the graph opens up, the parabola opens up. And if A is negative, then the graph opens downward. Your parabola opens down. Very good. So we talked about how to solve a differential equation, how to find the zeros, how to find x-intercepts. To find zeros or x-intercept of a quadratic equation, we can always use x equals to minus b plus square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a, x equals to minus b minus square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. When we are solving these two, we can find the zeros, x-intercepts of the graph. Sometimes there is no intersection between the graph and x-axis. Sometimes we have no x-intercept. Give us an example. For example, consider the following case. I ask you to find the zeros or solve x squared plus, for example, 2 equal to 0. How do we solve this? We say that, well, I have a quadratic equation, all right? I have x squared plus something equal to 0. This is a quadratic equation. But how do I solve that? We can say that, well, I have a nice formula for quadratic equation. I need to identify A, identify B, identify C. So compare this guy with a quadratic equation. A x squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. Your quadratic equation has 3 terms on the left-hand side. This guy has only 2 terms on the left-hand side. Something is missing. You don't see any x. The linear term is missing. What's the meaning of that? It means that it is x squared plus 0x plus 2 equal to 0. Whenever you don't see any variable, it means that the coefficient was equal to 0. 0 times x is just vanish. It disappears. You end up with x squared plus 2 equal to 0. So that's how you can identify your A, B, and C. So just take a look at this. A is 1, B is 0, and C is 2. Now you can plug those into the quadratic formula and solve it. X is equal to minus B, which is 0, plus square root of b squared, 0 squared minus 4, a is 1, and c is 2, divided by 2 times a is 1. What do we get? We get square root of negative 8 divided by 2. Very well. We have a negative number inside the radical. What should I do with this? The second x is 0 minus square root of 0 minus 4 times 1 times 2 divided by 2 times 1. Again, I get negative square root of minus 8 divided by 2. What should I do with this minus? So, note that square root of negative 8 is not minus square root of 8. It's a no. We cannot write it this way. They are not equal to each other. You cannot take this negative sign outside your radical. We have a definition for this guy. Here we introduce the complex numbers. So let's try to analyze this. We need a new concept. We need a new name. We need a new mathematical object. Here we have definition. Definition of complex numbers or imaginary numbers. We define it this way. A complex number is of the form a plus I times b. I is equal to square root of negative 1. So wherever you see square root of negative 1, it means that you have the complex identity. I is complex identity. We are learning something new. From real numbers, we now introduce a bunch of new numbers, complex numbers. We say that, hey, a complex number is of the form a plus I times b. What is I? I is the square root of negative 1. Okay, now let us take a look at your answers for previous example. In previous example, we had negative sign inside the radical. In previous example, we have square root of negative 8 divided by 2. Guys, square root, the whole thing is on top. 2 is not inside the radical. So you can write this as the square root of negative 1 times 8 divided by 2. We can separate these two numbers and write it as square root of negative 1 times square root of 8 divided by 2. You just define something new. They say that, hey, wherever you see square root of negative 1, just replace it by I. So this guy has a name. This guy has a notation, which is I. So far I got I times square root of 8 divided by 2. What's the simplification of 8? 8 is 2 times 4, am I right? So you can write it as I times square root of 2 times square root of 4 divided by 2. Square root of 4 is just 2. So what's left? We have I times square root of 2 times 2 divided by 2, or square root of 2 times I. our x is a complex number or imaginary number. So this guy becomes square root of 2 times I. This guy has a negative sign next to it. This x becomes negative square root of 2 times I. We found two imaginary solutions for this differential, for this quadratic equation. Two complex solutions.